All right, the last part of this segment that's based on suspension and linkages is to make sure that the sway bars are properly set up. The sway bars are something that's heavily overlooked, but can make a big difference in the performance of your car. The first thing when tuning the sway bars is the placement of the collet onto the bar itself. As you see where the collet is right now, it's typically about how I run mine on my car. The one thing you can do in tuning the sway bar is to bring the collet all the way flush out to the end of the bar, or to move the collet further in toward the bulkhead of the car. As you move the collet in toward the bulkhead of the car, what that's going to do is that's going to increase the reactivity of the sway bar, meaning that one suspension arm isn't going to come up as far before the other arm also has an effect by the sway bar. Running the collet way out here toward the end, flush at the end of the sway bar, is going to give one suspension arm a good bit more travel upward in its motion before the other suspension arm is impacted by the effect of the sway bar. So that's one way to use sway bar collets and sway bars as a tuning measure. Also, the further in you go on the bar doesn't increase the stiffness of the bar, but it just gives the car a more reactive feel, almost as if you had a stiffer bar on the car. Another thing you want to do when setting up the unit that bolts into the A-arm is to make sure that you have the height of that assembly to where the sway bar sits level with the bulkhead. You don't want to have those too long to where it has an upward angle like so, or you don't want to have them too short to where the sway bar is always in a downward motion. You want to keep that sway bar in a perfect, straight angle with the bulkhead so that it has an even feel. All right, the last way to tune the sway bar, other than adjusting obviously the thickness of the sway bar, is how far the set screws in the bulkhead are ran in. If you run the set screws in too far, you're going to bottom them out on the sway bar, which isn't going to give it free up and down motion that it needs to have. All right, when the suspension compresses, you don't want the sway bar to have an effect. The sway bar should only have an effect when one arm comes up while the other one doesn't. All right, so you want to back the set screws off here just enough to where you have a little bit of back and forth movement. All right, having just a little bit of back and forth movement on those screws, allowing the bar to have free motion is your optimal setting. Removing the set screws altogether can actually be sort of a tuning option as well, because that's just going to give the sway bar more overall play inside the bulkhead, to where subtle movements of the suspension won't be impacted by the sway bar. Typically on very rough, very rutted, blown out racetracks, sometimes what I'll do is actually remove the set screws right here at the front of the sway bar and move the collets all the way out to the end of the bar. That way you still have the effects of the sway bar under extreme motions, but as the left and right suspension arms and wheels and tires go through small bumps and small areas of the racetrack that are imperfect, it's not affected by the sway bar, and it actually gives the car a little bit more forgiveness and a little bit more stability through those rough, choppy sections. All right, the next part that we're going to focus on is getting the differentials in the car built correctly. They'll only go together pretty much one way, but there are a couple things you want to look for to get the best performance out of them. The first thing comes from greasing and lubricating the O-rings. One thing I like to use on mine is available at any auto parts store. It's made by Lucas Oil. It's a red silicone grease that I apply to the O-rings prior to installing them. So what you want to do is you just get a little bit on your finger and coat the O-ring pretty well with the red grease prior to sliding it onto the input shaft of the outdrive. So once you get your O-ring lubed up with grease, you'll get it set in place. You'll also want to lube the groove for the small O-ring as well as lubricate the larger O-ring. As far as the O-rings and the differentials go, a lot of guys prefer to use an O-ring that's made by Kyosho, which is that orange one you saw me use. Team Associators actually came out with a more updated version of the O-rings that are actually going to be clear in color, so if you see those, those work great as well. All right, when putting the diff together and getting it all sealed up, one thing you want to do, this is actually a diff that's been ran, so it's actually a rebuild, not a build from scratch. But on a brand new diff, one thing you're going to want to do is use a very fine grit sandpaper and turn the diff half upside down and just kind of finely sand down the case, in a circular motion, so that you get any imperfections off the top of the case to get a really good seal onto the paper gasket. You don't want any high spots or low spots that fluid can seep out of. Next, as we fill the diff, there's really no need to get all the fine amount of old oil out of the diff. Turn it upside down, let it drain. Once you get the majority of that oil out, that's sufficient enough. Once you get the gears turned in a little bit, you're going to get it worked down into the case. Proper level for filling up the differentials is you want fluid to come up basically just above the top pin on the differential itself. You don't want to fill them up to the top. You don't want to underfill them either. So that's the level of fluid that you want to look for. Again, just where you have fluid just right above the top pin. If you overfill the diff, what can happen is you actually create too much fluid pressure, and that can actually cause the diff to leak prematurely. So actually slightly underfilling them is better than actually overfilling them. One little trick I like to use when putting these together is I'll put just a small amount of black grease on the gear itself, right where the gasket goes. That way when you set the gasket in place and line the holes up, that black grease is going to hold that gasket in place. You won't let it slide around and won't let it fall off when you go to reinstall the gear. So now that we're going to do that, the rest is just pretty much straightforward to where you'll set your gear on, run your screws in. Then after that, you've got a properly built diff. Alright, the next topic that we're going to focus on is getting the shocks built correctly with the amount of rebound desired. One key aspect in getting the car to handle well, and especially to jump flat, over jumps to keep the car flying straight, is to make sure you get the same amount of rebound built into your shocks. And when you're checking rebound, you want to pull the shock boot down over the shock end so you get a good visual, and also you take away the boot possibly rubbing on the shaft, affecting the rebound when checking these. These are already built and everything's ready to go. One thing you want to do while rebuilding your shocks or building them for the first time is to set the bladder in place in the shock cap prior to screwing the shock cap on. If you set the bladder on top of the body and then try to screw the shock on, there's a good chance that that bladder is going to be knocked loose and can actually be sucked down into the shock body. So that's why it's important to set the bladder into the cap first, then thread it on. Alright, these have already been bled. I typically on my cars like to run anywhere between 1/2 to 3/4 rebound settings. That can change a little bit if it's high traction, smooth track versus low traction, bumpy track. But nonetheless, when I build my shocks and I bleed them, you want to make sure that both the left and right are done the same. So the way I like to do this is very simple. Run the shaft up and down a couple times, then I'll compress the shock at the same time and lift up on them at the same time. And I'll watch the amount of rebound, and I'll also watch, more importantly, the speed of the rebound. If I have two shocks that the rebound is just barely off on, but the speed of the rebound is exactly the same, that's what I like to see, is that one shock doesn't want to rebound a whole lot faster than the other. So again, you'll want to just check those, and when you compare them, you'll see that basically the amount of rebound on these two shocks is going to be pretty identical. And then if you have one shock that rebounds significantly faster or significantly slower, the way to fix that is by bleeding the excess oil back out of the shock. Let's say if this shock rebounded further than the other one, I would loosen the cap, bleed just a little bit of oil until it ran out, retighten the cap, then try it again. And you'll repeat the process of bleeding oil out of the shock with the most rebound until they are the same.